Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's Provost Conversations on Teaching and Learning. I'm Joy Fisher-Sykes with the Center for Learning and Teaching. We have a very exciting program, so I would ask that you please join me in welcoming Provost Carol Simpson for our introduction of our speaker today.
Thank you.
You're so welcome.
Thank you, and thank you all for coming indoors on such a gorgeous day. I mean, it really shows dedication. You've got quite the pull there, Jason, to bring people in. I'm really pleased to be able to introduce today's conversation leader, Jason Osborne. Jason's not been with us terribly long, but he is an associate professor of educational foundations and leadership, and has a good background in that. We were delighted to be able to recruit him to ODU. I believe, I'm told, that he's also a black belt in Taekwondo. So we have to behave ourselves, right? Is that true? We actually are? Okay, good. So that's obviously one reason way that he manages to keep his students engaged in what he's doing. But seriously, though, Jason has been teaching particularly statistics and research methods for about 20 years, he says, and using a modified version of mastery learning, which is what we're going to learn about today, I understand. He's going to discuss his research on student achievement, on motivation, engagement, and resiliency, which are all things that we worry about and want to encourage in our students. And he's going to share his experiences with us as he shares the question of whether making learning fun is actually a good thing or not. So, with no further ado, I hand you Jason Osborne. Welcome.
Thank you very much. Students seem indoctrinated to expect entertainment, and teachers and faculty seem to feel like they have to be entertaining to keep the students motivated and interested and things like that. And for someone like me who's not naturally entertaining, that's kind of a big challenge, right? So as an educational psychologist, I thought, well, I think there's some science about what we can do that may not involve entertainment, but may be engaging, motivating, helping students become enthusiastic and actually learn the material rather than just be entertained by the material. So that's kind of where I'm coming to today. There is research out there in the literature that shows that this thing I call edutainment is important. This is one study I ran across very quickly when I started my literature search, and this is a couple of folks from England. And they surveyed 400 university students, and they looked at who they had voted for the Tutor of the Year, which is the Faculty Teaching Award, and why they voted that way. And so they interviewed all these students. And one of the top reasons why they voted for the Tutor of the Year was because they were entertaining. And of course, students like entertaining faculty, so there's this kind of self-perpetuating cycle of those who are entertaining are viewed more positively by the students, and then the students view them more positively. What didn't make the headlines, however, was that the other reason students said they voted for a particular person for Tutor of the Year was that they helped students learn better by providing feedback. Now, you may already know where I'm going with this, and from an educational psychology point of view, providing real, concrete feedback to students is much more educationally beneficial than being entertaining. But what the media and what other people focused on was the entertainment part of that study. The other thing that we need to note is that being popular does not necessarily mean you're effective. So if we care about, thank you. I was raised Lutheran, but if you want to shout out, that's fine. I enjoy that. So we need to focus on that as well. What makes an effective teacher, and what makes for an effective learning environment? And that's really where I want to go today. So I'm going to argue a couple things. I'll just give you an advanced organizer where I'm going to go, so you can leave if you have to. I'm going to focus on the concept of expertise, not intelligence, because first of all, intelligence, we don't really know what it is. I have a whole hour-and-a-half long lecture. If you want to stay for that one, we can do that later. But it's also not necessarily malleable, whereas expertise is learnable and malleable. So I'm going to argue expertise is what we should be worrying about. I already said expertise is malleable. I believe, and other educational psychologists believe, that all students, not just ODU students, but almost all students, unless they have severe disabilities, can learn most of the stuff that's part of the standard course of study in K-12 or our goals and objectives in higher education, given appropriate resources. That's the key there. And finally, simple teaching practices can support faculty. There's nothing like an unhappy faculty member to really dampen the mood in a classroom. I think that the things that I'm going to focus on and that some educational psychologists focus on make students more happier, they help the learning, and they make faculty more effective as well. Because at the end, this is the punchline, students enjoy feelings of mastery. That's a basic motivation. So entertainment is fine, that's pleasant for the moment, but the real lasting effect is if I feel like I've really mastered a concept and can develop competence, then I also enjoy that, right? So that's where I'm going with this. So let's start off with a little exercise here. I'm sure you all are up for some mental math. So let's go ahead and do this. We're going to see how intelligent you are. Raise your hand when you have an answer. So the problem is you throw a ball from a height of 1 meter from the ground with an initial velocity of 10 meters per second, accounting for the pull of gravity. That gives us this very simple equation, negative 4.9x squared plus 10x plus 1, where x equals time in seconds. Your job is to mentally calculate how many seconds it takes to reach the top of the trajectory of the ball. And go ahead and raise your hand when you've got the answer. C. Right, it is C. And Provost Simpson won't even make eye contact with me. So that's really how it goes. So is this a fair test of your intelligence? If I want to see how intelligent you are, the answer is no. So this is how my friends and I in high school, we would have said about a second. And it would have taken us about 5 seconds to mentally calculate that. That's because we spent a lot of time doing parabola problems in calculus. And this is how it would work. Very simple. If you're in a calculus frame of mind, you set the change in height or change in x equals negative 9.x. You take the first derivative of the equation. You set dh over dx to be 0 because that's the height of the parabola. You solve this very simple problem. If I had said to you, hey, here's a problem, what's x? Most of you could have said, it's about 1, give or take. Right? That's simple algebra once we distill it from calculus. An expert who recognizes this kind of you toss a ball up in the air, how long does it take to get to the top thing, or you lob a missile at your neighbor country, how long does it take to reach? That's a very simple equation. They could immediately go to this trick of take the first derivative, set it equal to 0, and because 9.8 is about 10, what experts do is they say, it's about this. And they don't worry that it's 1.02. Usually pretty close is good enough, unless you actually are lobbing missiles, then you want to be a little more precise. But most people who are expert in this thing could do this very quickly. That makes them look very intelligent. But having just explained this, if you and I sat down for a couple minutes, I could teach you this trick. We could run through a few problems. You could learn this and do this. So solving parabola problems through calculus is not really a sign of intelligence per se. It's a sign of expertise in a very particular esoteric topic. And I would argue that almost anyone can learn this. It's not difficult. If you can subtract and add and divide, you can do this kind of problem if I teach you the steps. So this is the difference between intelligence and expertise. Expertise is something I can help you acquire, or you can acquire on your own. Intelligence is this thing we think people have or they don't. You're intelligent or you're not. And if I can do this kind of thing in my head very quickly, I tend to give the perception I'm very smart. I may not be very smart, though. I just may have learned these little expertise tricks. So that's kind of an overview of the difference between expertise and intelligence. Now I'm going to introduce one of my favorite theorists, John Carroll, who talked a lot about intelligence. And if you're not familiar with the field of intelligence, we've been going around for about 130 years on this topic. And we've had a lot of different ideas as to what intelligence is. And we have the multiple intelligences camp, and we have the 1902 Spearman camp where it's, there's this general intelligence and specific intelligence and all that stuff. It doesn't matter. What John Carroll came around to is it doesn't matter what we define intelligence as. His view is intelligence is the amount of time needed to learn a task. The amount of time needed to learn a novel task, let's say. So something you've never done before. So if I can take all of you and sit down and give you a couple of parabola problems and teach you how to take a first derivative and how to, add and subtract and stuff, some of you would very quickly pick it up depending on your expertise in mathematics and your background. Some of you would take a little bit longer, but I would guess that most of you would get it pretty quickly. And according to John Carroll, those of you who get it a little quickly, then we can say, well, that's more intelligence or less intelligence. But that's not important. What's important about Carroll is that he radically turned the view of intelligence on its head. Because traditionally what we do in education is this irrational thing where we say we have a fixed amount of time. We have 15 class meetings of 2 hours and 40 minutes each, or we have 180 instructional days in the public school calendar of X number of hours per day, and your level of intelligence is how much you can learn in that fixed time. What Carroll said is, we're going to hold the amount you learn constant, and we're going to vary how much time it takes you. So the amount of time it takes you to learn that thing will vary. And that was a really profound difference between the traditional view of intelligence. We have fast learners and slow learners. Carroll came and said, no. Everyone can learn. The difference is how long it takes them to learn. So the implication, which is profound, and which led and infuses the mastery learning movement, is the notion that all students can learn most things, unless they're, profound issues. So most students can learn most things most of the time given appropriate time and resources. And that's a very different concept than many of us have in education, where we have fixed amount of time, fixed contact with the students, and they learn it or they don't. So in our culture and in our educational system, we have this notion that faster is smarter. The students who learn X amount of topics quicker, we view them as smarter. The ones who take longer, we view them as less smart. So we have the euphemism. We say fast learner, slow learner. And back in the old days, we used to use other euphemisms. But the important thing is that as a culture, we're fighting this trend of, faster learning means you're more intelligent. So let's look at a little bit of the research on fast and slow learners. We've been doing this for about 40 years now. And there are individual differences in the rate that students learn. And there's a lot of research on why that is. Some students pay more attention. So if you don't pay attention, you can't learn, right? So I always had students in the back of my large lecture section, they're surfing Sports Illustrated, or they're shopping for new boots, so they're not going to learn as quickly as someone who's laser focused on the brilliance that I'm spewing from the front of the room. How much scaffolding and integrating into existing knowledge they have. So if they already have exposure to the material, they'll learn more quickly. If we have some kind of metacognitive stuff going on, some students are more efficient in terms of how they process things. And we have savings and transfer from exposure again. So there are lots of reasons why students learn at different rates. It's not some kind of speed difference of their neurons. It's not that they can't learn. It's not that they're just always slower. Sometimes they're slow in one area and they're faster in another area. There's no evidence after 40 years of looking at this that slow learners can't learn the stuff. What they can't do is learn it as fast as fast learners. So if we have slow learners and fast learners in a fixed amount of time, the slow learners lose out, right? And the fast learners are bored. So what else do we know about slow and fast learners? Well, in research, slow learners take up to 3 times as many learning trials. So if you give them something that is novel, you give slow and fast learners novel stuff, slow learners can take up to 3 times as many tries. But they all get given appropriate support and resources. They all get to the same point. What's more important, in my mind, is the next bit of research that shows that once something's mastered at a high level, forgetting occurs at the same rate. So if I take all my students from the slowest to the fastest and I move them to a particular level of mastery, then they all, everyone forgets something they've learned, right? all of you will as well. But the forgetting occurs at roughly the same rate. So if we get everyone to an initial baseline, everyone starts forgetting, we remind them, they come back up to mastery at the same rate. They're not slower coming back up, they come back up at the same rate. Why is that? That's because they've established expertise. They are now equally expert in whatever it is, whether it's parabola problems or reading or learning how to use a new piece of software. And so in education, we're shooting ourselves in the foot because we have this irrational idea that given a fixed amount of time, everyone should be able to master material. If we change that to starting in preschool or kindergarten, everyone comes up to the same level of mastery and then moves forward from there, we reduce a lot of the differences between slow and fast learners. People who are initially slow and initially fast are now pretty much the same. Expertise confers a lot of real cognitive advantages. Experts organize and encode information differently. So if you talk to someone who's expert in chess, they can remember details of tons of games they've seen, whereas me, who I know the horsey moves a certain way and the other thing, I don't even know the names, right? So I can't encode that information as efficiently. They will look like rocket scientists compared to me because they're encoding and remembering a lot differently. That doesn't mean I can't do it. I just have to come up to the level of mastery. So once you have expertise, you encode and remember things much more efficiently. That makes you smarter. Experts are more strategic and metacognitive. If you develop expertise in an area, then you're more strategic. You're able to understand what you know, what you don't know. And if you can just focus on what you don't know, you're much more effective in learning that than if you aren't thinking in that term and you study everything. So we all have students who, if you have 20 things they have to study for the test, they'll spend equal amounts of time on everything, even though they already know the first 7. That's wasted time that they could be spending on the other 13, right? When slow learners are prompted to use these strategies that experts use, they perform much better. So it's not even developing the expertise that's important, although that is valuable. Using the strategies that these fast learners use helps students learn more effectively. And in fact, when I was doing my dissertation, I ran across a study that showed that they took profoundly mentally handicapped individuals, people with IQs in the 60, 70 range. That may not be profound, but it's certainly not, advanced, right? And they took gifted students, so students who are in the other end of the distribution, and they studied what strategies the gifted students were using. They went to the mentally handicapped group, taught them those skills, and when those students or those individuals used those skills, their performance raised dramatically, not to the level of a gifted student, but to the level where they were indistinguishable from an average student. So they went from really going to be in difficulty to performing on par with where we would expect most students. It was just one study, but it shows that it's strategies that are conferred by expertise that make the difference. It's not in the head. It's not some kind of speed limit in your brain, right? So slow and fast learners differ because of expertise. Expertise gives you very important advantages. So why am I going through all this? Because we're talking about edutainment and how to stimulate students. My friend, the professor who dressed up as plant anatomy, entertaining, interesting, but that doesn't mean that he's helping their students become masters of the material. And bad things can happen when people are interested but have no expertise in what they're interested in. So we have to develop both interest and expertise and support students to do both. So how do we develop expertise? Well, we know a lot about this from metacognition and other types of research. I think it requires a different approach. I think it requires a John Carroll type approach, a mastery learning approach. So instead of having this irrational view of we have a fixed amount of time and you're going to learn what you're going to learn in that fixed amount of time, what we need to think about is developing expertise, giving students appropriate resources and support so that they develop this mastery at a high level. And that makes students feel really good about themselves. When you feel competent, you often feel more positive about the subject. So instead of singing science songs and dressing up as chemicals, if we actually have them learn the material, do experiments successfully, feel how interesting. I mean, we're all here because we are passionate about learning and teaching, and that's what our lives are devoted to, right? So why did we become that way? At some point we got sparked, and it probably wasn't because of a teacher standing in front of us singing a silly song or wearing a costume, although that's always fun. It's probably because we developed feelings of competence, whether they're rooted in reality or not. Some people, some people feel competent and they're not. But I watch my 3-year-old daughter. She explores the world. She's a natural scientist. She loves learning new things. And then I'm going to watch my teenage sons come home and say, oh, God, I got to study Latin verbs. The enjoyment gets pounded out of them somehow. And just dancing and singing in front of the class isn't going to help that. Traditional instruction holds time constant and allows achievement to vary within groups of students. I think that that's not the approach we want in education. We don't want the little frowny faces in our classrooms. We don't want students feeling disenfranchised and frustrated and angry and feeling like this isn't for me. It doesn't take a whole lot of work to adjust your teaching to focus on holding learning constant and allowing the time to master to vary. So it's just a different mindset. When most of the students in your class have mastered most of the stuff most of the time, your classroom is much easier to teach and your students are much more engaged than when you have wide divisions between those who are most and least capable. Back in the 1960s, some of you may know Bloom's taxonomy. This is the same Benjamin Bloom who was passionate about teaching his psychology undergraduates. They're huge lecture classes, and he became frustrated because most students weren't doing very well. In fact, at one point he stopped and he said, only 20% of my students are getting an A, and that bothers me because I think most students should be able to master this stuff. So he, on his own, developed Bloom's Learning for Mastery. And the key, again, kind of separate from John Carroll and all these other mastery learning people, but he kind of came up with this stuff that makes sense from an educational psychology point of view. We're going to individualize the amount of time to learn an objective. We're going to hold constant the learning. So we want everyone to master. If you need more time in this large lecture section of undergraduate psychology students, he figured out a way to do it. First of all, he used criterion-based grading. No curves. Curves are bad in this world because we don't know how much everyone learns. We just know how much everyone learns relative to everyone else in the class. So he said, here's my criterion. These are the objectives I want you to learn. This is the level I want you to learn it at. And I will know you've mastered it if you get this score on my test. And we could talk a lot about criterion reference assessment, but that's not the topic of today's talk. So the first thing he did was set the criteria. The second thing he did was allow for time to vary. So he would give a test of mastery. If the student did well enough, then he said, okay, you've mastered, you move forward. If they didn't do well, he had office hours where TAs and other materials were prepared, where the students could then go and get extra remediation and then retest to see if they've mastered. So they got specific feedback on what they had mastered and what they hadn't mastered, and support and resources to go back and reattempt mastery of the material. Of course, additional instructional help comes at a very expensive cost. I mean, he had to pay TAs, and they had to have a place where students could go for help. But Old Dominion already has a lot of resources that they commit to student success, right? So, and a lot of us spend a lot of time trying to put resources in students' hands. So this is not something that's foreign to what we're doing already. The results, after 2 years, with the same standards, 90% of his students were getting A's. The message, so the same tests, same standards, same everything, 20% to 90%. The only difference was the orientation. The message the students got is, I'm going to hold you to high standards. If you don't meet those standards, I'm not just going to give you a lousy grade, I'm going to do something to help you. Here's how you do it. So that worked pretty well, and there's been other pilot tests around the country in K-12 schools and in other things throughout the last 100 years that showed similar things. The problem is that if you're a traditionalist and you hear about this mastery learning thing where 90% of your students are getting A's, then you're going to have people say, well, aren't you really dumbing down the curriculum? Or aren't you really just feeding, spoon feeding your students? And I have two responses to that. I have a lot of responses, but I'll only share two with you at this point. Is there any other venue outside formal education where we would accept this? I don't know about you guys, but I don't want my doctor that's looking at my daughter to have not mastered the material. I don't want the guy who built the bridge that I drive across to not have fully mastered the material. In sports, you don't take a 5-year-old, give him a soccer ball and say, no, you didn't do well, you're never going to play soccer again. We don't do that with driving tests. Can you imagine if we did that with driving tests? First test, you fail, nope, you can't do it. We just give you a bad grade, move on. No driving for you. So we don't accept it anywhere else, but we have this irrational view that in education this should be acceptable. I disagree. Secondly, I don't think it's smart to allow students to not learn the material. I teach statistics a lot. I don't want them going out of my class and not knowing, X, Y, and Z going into the next class. That doesn't do them any good, and it frustrates the heck out of me when I'm teaching the next class. Right? So I don't think it's smart to allow students to not learn the material. Some students are happy to just take a mediocre grade and get out. I don't allow that. I don't want them to, especially when I was teaching pre-service teachers. Right? Because I would always say to my students, you may be teaching my kids someday. I want you to know this stuff. And in fact, in 10 years in Raleigh, a lot of those teachers did end up teaching my kids, and they would always joke with me about that after. But I think it's important. If we care about this stuff, we should hold students accountable. So the important points so far, and I know I'm probably getting long-winded, but mastery learning is the natural state of affairs, I think, for human beings. We naturally try again, relearn, try again, and so forth. Mastery learning makes sense from an educational, psychological, ethical, humanistic perspective. If students want to learn this stuff, we should have some way for them to learn it. Mastery learning allows you to hold students to high expectations. When they're in my class, if they have to revise and resubmit, I tell them you have to revise and resubmit. I don't give them a bad grade. So I can have very high standards because there aren't consequences for them except they actually have to do the right thing, right? So how do you implement mastery learning? I'm going to take just a couple more minutes to talk about how I do it in two different types of classes, and then we'll kind of put our heads together and see how you could do it maybe in your class as well. So the first venue I did was my large undergraduate lecture section, my pre-service teachers at NC State. It worked very well for 10 years. And this is basically the conceptual map of how it works. You have some kind of goal, and so you have some kind of experience, whether it's a lecture or an experiment or some kind of experiential learning or individual learning, whatever it is. You then have some kind of formative assessment. Did you master the material or not? And feedback. So either you mastered the material, and that's fine, you move on to step 2, or you didn't master, you mastered this, but you didn't master that. So you need to work on what you didn't master. So then there's some kind of additional support, resources, opportunity to learn, and then another assessment. And essentially we stay in that mindset until you've mastered that material successfully. So think driving test. Yes, you can use hand signals fine, but you didn't do the parallel parking. I'm going to have you keep practicing the parallel parking until you get it right. I'm not going to say just go ahead and start driving and you'll be a lousy driver. If you have mastered it, then you can go on to enrichment activities. So this is actually the fun part of the teaching and learning, right? So what I would do in my undergraduate ed psych class is then, so they learned something about, let's say, human development, child development, cognitive development, social development, whatever. They would then have activities where they would go and apply what they've learned, or observe, go to a classroom and observe, or whatever it is. So you take your knowledge and reinforce that by applying it in an authentic setting. And then once we're done enriching and making sure everyone's on the same page, move on to the second lesson. It may seem a little bit overwhelming to think about a 200-person lecture section doing that where people are at different stages. That's why I called it a modified mastery learning, because I didn't stop everything until everyone was on board. We had people working on different things at different rates, but I had to keep the class moving because we have this irrational expectation and the realities. So as we were moving forward, we would have enrichment happening at the same time we have the next lecture going on. At the same time, we have some students meeting with the TAs or doing extra reading and retesting and things like that. For those of you who are familiar with some of the advances in instructional technology, I was one of the first people to use Blackboard and Vista and those kinds of things at NC State for this purpose, where we could have learning modules online. We could do the testing, so I had this huge multi-thousand item test bank where they could test, get specific feedback, study what they didn't learn, retest, and I didn't have to be sitting in my office or have a TA doing it. It was a lot of online stuff, even though it was a face-to-face lecture. The remediation happened asynchronously. You also have to change your grading practice. You can't just give one-shot tests and then say, okay, this is your grade or that's your grade. So through the course of one semester, I would have 5 tests, what I would call mastery checks, because students get anxious about tests. Every 2 or 3 chapters, they'd take a test and they'd get feedback, and then, so I can check their progress, they can check their progress, and we know everyone's on the same page. But the functional aspect of this was if they passed the mastery check, they demonstrated they had mastery, then they were eligible to do some of the fun enrichment projects. So, through 5 units, they could choose 3 of them and do an enrichment project, and I had, multiple options of things they could do, but they were usually some kind of experiential, applied, authentic thing, and then they would write up a short, summary of what they did, and if they didn't do that well, then I'd tell them that they didn't do it well, and they'd have to go back and redo that as well. So by the end of the semester, we had both kind of the knowledge level, but also then the application level of knowledge. So again, Bloom's taxonomy says, there's multiple levels of mastery, and so I wanted to not just get the basic declarative knowledge, but also the application. And again, these were people who were going into classrooms, so I wanted to know that they not only knew the stuff, but that they could apply it with authentic venues, so that my kids, when they got my students, they would have a good experience. I also tried to model reflective practice. What are you thinking about today? How would you apply today's material? What do you need enrichment on? Get future teachers thinking about the state of their own knowledge. What do they know? What don't they know? What would they like to know? That kind of thing. And then I just converted that, because we have to use, well, at least at NC State we had A+, but we had to use some kind of thing. My personal experience was that most students got some kind of an A or A- because not because I had very easy expectations, but because they were given appropriate resources and they were motivated. They liked the stuff, they saw it as applicable to their future lives. So again, modified mastery, in a perfect world, you could have unlimited opportunities for success, for retesting. In a university environment, that's not possible. So I would have the mastery checks every 2 to 3 chapters. I would give them 2 to 3 opportunities through Blackboard to do it. I defined mastery as 85%. So I said, if you make an 85%, you're done. You've got mastery, you can move forward. You get full credit for that test. If you get less than an 85, then you can opt to go study and retake the test. But you can only do that 3 times. I'm not going to, because otherwise, students game the system and they'll take it 50 times and think randomly that somehow they'll get all the easy questions on one test and do it. So a couple of important things here. You have to operationalize what mastery means to you. I picked 85 because it's high enough that I was comfortable saying you've mastered it, but it's not impossible. I operationalized 3 attempts because I didn't want to spend my entire career writing items for tests. So I had enough that I thought, if you take it 3 times, odds are you're not going to get the same question twice. And this is very important. In mastery learning, the highest grade counts. So it's the final state. I've seen professors and teachers dock points if you have to take a test again and again. And that really violates the spirit of mastery, which is, it doesn't matter how long it takes you to get there as long as you get there, within reason. So that's how I did it. I'm not saying that's right, but that's how I did it in the undergraduate class. For enrichment, they could only do enrichment after they've demonstrated mastery. You can't enrich something that you haven't mastered. And then, feedback. I gave them choice of projects, feedback, revision, things like that. I've already talked about that. Over 10 years, teaching almost every semester, so I had almost 3,500 students. This was my grade distribution. I did keep track of this, and every semester I showed this to the students, saying this is what my past grade distribution is. It doesn't mean you're going to get here, but if you want to get here, here's how you do it. Here's the objectives, study the objectives, take the test, make sure you do that, do the enrichment projects, do the reflections, there you go. If you have to revise something, revise something. People who scored down in this end of the distribution chose not to do that. They would take a test, decide they're not going to retake it. That's fine. I would say you can choose your grade in my class. You can choose to get an A, you can choose to get an F. So, having said all that, the other thing I would say to you is at the graduate level, I also do this when I teach statistics, because a lot of my students come in very anxious. It's not the kind of online multiple choice testing, and at that level it's more open-ended. Tell me what you know about this. Here's a data set. Do this analysis. If you don't do it, you're going to have to redo it, kind of thing. So at the doctoral level, it's a little different, but it's the same spirit. So that everyone can do it, given the appropriate. So, given your classes, can you see taking these principles and adapting them to your students so that you hold learning constant and give appropriate resources? This is where the discussion part, I think, occurs. Yes, sir.
For tests, the 3 tests in each one of your areas, you don't have any time limits on those either, right?
Because it's an online environment where they could access it from home, or I have kind of some weird philosophy. So I would give them, I think on average, 90 seconds per item maximum. And sometimes there were scenarios they had to read and things like that.
How about the time it takes to take those 3 tests?
Each test was timed. But
no, I mean, could they wait until the end of the semester and take those to test 1, test 2, test 3?
Yeah. I experimented with that. In the mastery learning world, they would say that probably is okay. In the reality of undergraduate education, what I found is that many students would blow off the entire course until the day before finals and then try to take all 5, and then they were upset when they couldn't do them. So what I would do is I would have certain windows of opportunity. You have, during September, you have access to 1 and 2, and then 2 and 3, and 3. So it is some kind of a moving average, yeah. Because you want students to have mastered units 1 and 2 before they start unit 5, right? Yeah, good question, thank you. What other kinds of things are you?
I have a question as well. You said that they can't go on to the enrichment until they had mastered the content?
They cannot do an enrichment project until they master the content.
So what about students who said, I'll take the D? Did they never get to do the enrichment?
Yeah.
So then they never had that opportunity. Well, then how do you deal with the students who feel that they're never going to catch up? Did you experience any lack of motivation due to students saying, I failed the first one, now I'm behind, now I can't catch up? Was that ever anecdotally expressed to you?
Okay, so if they failed the first one and they failed it 3 times?
Yeah, so they couldn't get to 85%. Let's say that they're at 75% every time.
So my philosophy, and this took a lot of experimentation, and it still does, they could do 3 enrichment projects out of 5 units. So if they really blow the first unit, and many undergraduates would, then I had the requirement that they would meet with the TAs or myself and talk about their study skills. We had a study skills boot camp that was online. So then they would be required to complete that. They weren't allowed to do enrichment projects because they hadn't demonstrated mastery, right? So you can't enrich something that you haven't mastered.
Right.
But what we did was try to make sure that in the second unit, their study skills would improve to the point where they could, if they were motivated, demonstrate mastery. And if in the first 2 units they couldn't get there, then that was maybe 2% of the students at the most. Then we would have a serious meeting about this class may not be right for you at this time, and try to figure out. We'd refer them to learning support services or something, because this is not rocket science. It's a lot of complex stuff sometimes, but anyone can master it. So they either weren't trying, they didn't have the right skills, or something. So we worked to remediate them.
Okay.
Yeah. So no one who did all that stuff and wanted to get a good grade, they weren't excluded. So that was important too. That was part of the scaffolding, the study skills and things like that. Which.
Jason, it's a fascinating way of thinking about how you go about this. I was just curious by something that you said in passing there, and maybe I misheard it, but I thought you said that on the test, when they do the testing, that you still give them a 90-second time slot to do it in. So isn't that going against your philosophy that it's not how long it takes? It's not, shouldn't be time, but you give them as long as it takes for them to get there.
Right. I may have misspoken. When I would create a test, I would give them, in Blackboard or Vista or Moodle or whatever I was using at the time, there you can have a time limit on the whole test. So if I was going to have 60 items, I would give them 45 minutes to do the whole test, an average of 90 seconds. And in my tests, they could take it, they didn't have to take it in class, so they could take it in their dorm, at home, at the library. So I would construct the items to be very applied, and so it was open book and open note and things like that. So they had to have enough time to read and be thoughtful about the items and access any resources they needed, but not so much time that they could be calling around to their friends to get answers or so there are realities. We have to balance the digital world and the online testing with the ideals. And so that was my personal balance.
It requires a great deal of thought going into the test, perhaps more so than for a standard list of questions.
It does take a long time to develop the item bank. The good news is that there are lots of resources in the 21st century out there for people. But yeah, I mean, we spent tremendous amounts of time creating the item banks. But once they're created, I taught for 10 years, I would revise every semester, but it was less and less time every semester I spent.
How do you deal with the...
Here comes trouble.
No. I run into this because I try to use mastery learning, but I often have institutional internal pressure that my grade distribution is not a bell-shaped curve.
Is it the provost?
How do you deal with those pressures?
So you have internal pressure about your grade distribution
Yes.
being heavily skewed toward A's?
Correct.
Mm-hmm. I actually almost never had that as a criticism when I was a faculty member in the College of Education. I would hope that as educators we would expect most of our students to master most of the things. So if I was ever questioned about that, I would go back to the one slide where I would say something like, okay, here's my philosophy. An A means you mastered the content, you were able to be reflective in your practice, and you did a certain amount of enrichment where you showed me you could apply. And that's what an A means. So tell me what's wrong about that. Or I would say to a faculty member who was criticizing that, so tell me why it's okay that your students don't learn most of the important objectives. Or why is it okay that you don't, give me a philosophy or an empirical reason why I shouldn't allow students to attain higher levels of mastery and demonstrate that. I think that's difficult for other people to do. The grade distribution thing, it is a political thing, but with good academic leadership, I think that becomes a non-issue. Yes, sir.
In general, I agree with the mastery approach.
But?
Well, the but is just when you get to graduate education, graduate education, especially doctoral level, if you're working with a clear set of criteria and you're talking about time needed, is there a line or a trade-off in what we expect our students to spend in terms of time to reach mastery level? In other words, I'm not real smart, so once I get some tasks, it may take me 15, 20 hours, and Sean will only take 2 hours. But that's something I accept as a student, and a responsibility I accept that it's going to take me a bunch more time, and I might have to read more stuff or access some of your other materials so that I can reach that criteria. Is that an issue? Is that even something worth talking about? It just seems a different
Yeah.
issue than K-12.
Well, so K-12 is a different issue than undergraduate education, which is a different issue than master or doctoral level education. But I think the principles are the same, and I think it's actually a less steep hill to climb in doctoral education. I think we naturally, when we're dealing with doc students, we have this idea that there's a certain level we want them to get to, and we're going to kind of keep hammering it. If they don't pass the comps, they can retake the comps. If they give us a paper that they're going to submit, heck, even if we submit a paper to a journal and they don't like it, they'll say revise and resubmit, right? They don't say you're out of the profession, go, work at McDonald's. So I think we naturally have that. I'm less worried about time at the doctoral level. Maybe that's just because I'm really difficult, but I think that the PhD, the EDD, the doctoral level stuff, it means something very specific and important in terms of scholarship and mastery of a large body of literature. And I think that we should give students time and resources to develop that mastery rather than changing the threshold. I know there are some PhD programs that I won't name that have certain, they say we'll get you out in 2.5 years, or we'll get you out in 3 years, or a certain number of semesters, and I think that that's completely wrong headed, and that's just me talking. So I think it's much more defensible at a doctoral level.
This is part question, part comment. So when we're thinking about the criteria by which you judge mastery, and you've got a point system there, it strikes me that students are still using an external criterion by which to base their own judgment of their own mastery. And in K-12 education, when we're moving towards performance standards and involving students in that conversation about a rubric, for example, about what that performance standard looks like and what their mastery really looks like and enables them to do. Did you ever have conversations with students where you sort of translated those point values into operationalized performance standards? And if so, did that help them to gain their own calibrated understanding of what it meant to have mastered something?
Yeah, let me just say a couple things about this. I was required by the university to have a point to grade conversion. In my ideal world, there would be 2 grades, mastered and not mastered. And some universities have experimented with that, Bowdoin and other universities. It tends to be problematic in practice, but in principle. So to answer your question more directly, what I would do is when I would describe each grade level, so I would say, okay, to me, a C, we would have a whole hour and 15-minute lecture on grading and what does it mean. So I would say, to me, a C means you demonstrate the minimal mastery. You have knowledge and you can communicate that knowledge. A B means you have knowledge and mastery and some enrichment. And A is the highest level of mastery that's reasonably expected. So you would have knowledge, you would have done an enrichment project, and you're a reflective practitioner, or in my graduate courses, sometimes I have them generate their own projects. So there are concrete meanings, and of course then we have this imperfect translation to what we have to report on the report cards and things. Yeah.
So I have a part comment, part question. So the comment side, it seems like I think that we already sort of, I think most faculty at least, sort of have a mastery orientation in the sense that when a student is struggling, when we would have a student that we might consider to be quote-unquote slow, that we're asking them to solve that problem, well, that just means you need to spend more time studying. And that seems to be, like, I think we're still setting a kind of a criterion level when we do that. And we're saying that there's a certain level of mastery that you need to have achieved in order to do what you need to do on this test based on the standards that I, as the expert, as the teacher, have set. And that because you are quote-unquote slow or a slow learner, or however you want to phrase it, that you're going to need to spend more time at home to do that. And this seems like we're sort of helping them along that process. Instead of saying you need to study on your own, we're going to give you specific steps and specific tools to kind of reach along that path. So that I think that idea makes sense to me, and I feel like we already do a little bit of that, but this is a better kind of structure for it. But what it leads to, and what I have a question about, is the effect on the student. Because it seems like this reminds me a lot of tracking in a kind of a K to 12 sense, that the students who are doing well get put in the good track, and the students who are struggling get put in the sort of remedial track. And we know in those settings that when a student knows that they're in the remedial track, there are other negative consequences to that. They know that they're struggling, and they know that other people know that they're struggling, and there's just a lot of kind of a negative psychological context to that.
Right.
So
Right,
I'm curious what the effect of that is. If a student knows that they're consistently missing out on the enrichment activities because they're spending so much time going through these secondary assessments, doesn't that seem like, to a student, that they're being punished for being a slow learner, and that the students who are fast learners are being rewarded?
Okay, so let me give a quick response. I would categorize students as expert or inexpert rather than slow or fast. So the substance to your question is important, and tracking is certainly a serious issue. I think that this is the antidote to tracking, because instead of putting you in the slow reading group, all right, so we'll have a K-12 example here, instead of being in the slow reading group and then always for the next 6 years being in the slow reading group, you get opportunities to increase your mastery so that you're not behind these guys at that point. You get brought up to the same level of mastery so that in the next year you're not 2 levels below in the reading group. Practically how that worked out in my class, what I saw is very little of that. What I saw was students would try to game the system the first mastery check. They'd figure, well, I have 3 attempts, I don't have to study at the first one, so I'd see them get a lot of 40s and 50s on the first test, and all of a sudden it'd jump up to 80, and then it'd be 87, and then the next time, very few of those 40s, because what they had to do was then spend a lot more time studying, right? So what I would always say to them is, look, I think I'm a lazy guy. I want to study, nail the test the first time, and be able to move forward. I don't want to have to keep going back and studying or revising and revising. And most of the students, by the 2nd, 3rd, 4th unit, they were on board with that. I taught them how to study, or they got help on how to study. I gave them the objectives. I tested them on the objectives. They knew what the criteria was, and they knew if they didn't meet it, they had to go back and redo it. So most of them, instead of becoming frustrated, would just say, look, I know what the deal is, I'm going to do it. That was my experience. But this is an anti-tracking philosophy, because instead of labeling students, we're empowering them to become more expert.
I was wondering if you could just speak a little bit more perhaps towards the resource side. In this sense, you sort of chided the botany teacher for his costumes and his songs, and yet one of the things that we know from, for example, teaching medicine, they in med schools teach students to come up with limericks to remember diagnostic procedures or anatomy or things like that, because those things are actually really good metacognitive strategies.
Yep.
And so and what you said is, for the fast learners, what you called at one time, they had strategies and metacognitive techniques which brought them to learn better, which the non-mastery students are going to need. Right. Which of those resources are available to us that you found to be the most effective in bringing your students up to a level of mastery? Thanks.
Okay, so there's a lot of stuff in there.
Yes, sorry. It's about the resources.
That's one of the great things about talking to other faculty.
Effective? Where do I go looking for those? You've given me the time side.
Let me point out one critical difference, first of all, with your premise, and that is, if I, as a professor, am making up the limericks or the songs or whatever, then that's different than if the students are. So in med school, when we're having the students generate these strategies, that's active processing of the material to help them memorize in the way that's optimal for them. So that's different than me in a costume, right? It may be memorable, but may not help you. So it's active versus passive learning there. And if your goal is merely memorizing stuff, then that's fine. But my goal in teaching, whether it's undergrad ed psych to pre-service teachers or stats to people who are going to be PhDs, is not memorization but application. So I have to get you to the knowledge, to the application, and how you evaluate that quickly, which isn't going to be served by me in a linear regression costume up in front of or singing songs. In terms of the resources, I think it's very individual in terms of what you're talking about. I mean, if we're in If we're in a physical sciences environment where there are labs and lectures and different things, it's different than if you're in, you know, a writing class or if you're in a psychology class. So I think the principle is that we need to value holding the learning constant and then look around us and see what the resources are to help us meet that goal. So we need to all write to our provost and say what are the resources that are available, and not to put you in the hot. No, I mean there are resources available, right? And if there aren't, then we often either invent them out of our own time or we can collaborate and work together. Shauna pioneered a educational research lab. So now we have a place where we can come together with students and we have the space and these resources. So that was something that just, you know, through her hard-headedness and perseverance, she got us this amazing resource, and we're going to have teach. So, you know, the resources, I can't answer that, but I think they're there if we try to find them.
If I can just jump on that as another ed psych, I would say there are some instructional strategies that you can use, such as peer tutoring and peer dialogue. And so you can find some of those students who are more metacognitively advanced, understand what strategies they're using, and then the benefit of having them explain and teach those strategies to some of those other students, in my experience, has been quite helpful. It's also helpful for those expert learners who have expertise in learning, not just the content area, because it makes them be more metacognitively aware and explicit about the strategies that they're using. So that's one thing I've found, at least, that doesn't really require any resource other than some space for those students to sit down and maybe some scaffolding from you as the tutor or the teacher.
If you build the structure, you just have to kind of create the situation where it can happen. And I think as faculty and as teachers, we can do a lot to squash this, or we can do a lot to facilitate it. So, you know, grading on a curve, having one-shot testing, not having opportunities for revising and resubmitting. I mean, we're all busy and overwhelmed with a lot of stuff, but having those kind of philosophies really cuts the legs out from under that kind of philosophy, whereas explicitly putting in your syllabus that you're going to require this kind of thing, that often just creates an energy of its own. So.
Wonderful. Dr. Osborne, thank you so much. Let's give him another hand
Thank
for
you
joining
very
us
much.
this afternoon.
Thank you.